Hey everybody, welcome to the Get Fit Guys, quick and dirty tips to get moving and shape up. My name is Brock Armstrong, and I am the Get Fit Guy. Strong hips will not only support your body weight with ease, but they also will give you the power to do the activities you love. So today I have 3 exercises for hip strength and hip mobility that you can start doing right away. Before we get into why you want strong hips and how to get them with some hip strengthening exercises, let's do a little Hip 101. The hip joint is what is called a ball and socket type joint that's formed when the femur, or your thigh bone, meets your pelvis. The femur has a ball-shaped, or you can think of it as club-shaped end that fits into a bowl-shaped socket that's formed by the pelvis, and that is called the acetabulum. There are large ligaments and tendons and muscles that run around the hip joint that hold the bones, the good old ball and socket, in place and keep it from doing things like dislocating, which can really hurt. Ideally, there is a smooth, cushiony piece of material called the hyaline, or articular cartilage, covering the femoral head of the acetabulum. The cartilage is kept slippery by a liquid called synovial fluid, which is 3 times more slippery than ice. This synovial fluid allows us to flex and move and wiggle our joints, even under great pressure, without giving it too much wear and tear. But when the cartilage becomes damaged, whether it's from osteoarthritis, which is a wear and tear type arthritis, or from some other type of injury or trauma, the hip joint motion can become painful, and the result is usually a limited range of motion. But a healthy hip can support the weight of you standing and walking, which can equal up to 5 times your body weight, and allow you to move without pain. But changes in the hip, including injury and weakening, will alter your gait and place unusual amounts and unusual types of stress on the joints above and below. Now, don't worry, it does take some seriously great force to damage the hip irrevocably, but that is not what we're focusing on here. We are focusing today on the stuff that we can control, things like strength and mobility. So, why should you even worry about your hips? Well, strength and stamina and speed are awesome, of course, especially if you're an athlete, or even if you just pretend to be one on weekends. But every single one of us, regardless of our age or fitness level, needs to have the ability to move our bodies through a full range of motion. Not everyone is interested in picking up a kettlebell or going for a killer bike ride or playing hockey, but we still want to, and indeed have to, get around in our multi-surfaced world. To truly thrive on this planet, we need to pay attention to the full, unrestricted movement of our human meat sacks, also known as our bodies. One of the best ways to do that is to regain and then maintain hip strength and mobility. A report called Importance of Comprehensive Hip Strengthening, written for the Journal of Strength and Conditioning back in 2012, outlined very nicely why having strong hips is an important part of being an athlete and also being a fit and healthy individual on this planet. And this is what the report said. It is important for athletes to have strong hip muscles that provide forceful movements in 3 degrees of freedom: flexion extension, abduction adduction, and internal rotation external rotation. It is also important that these muscles are strong to stabilize the pelvis, which will allow a stable foundation for lower extremity kinetic chain movements. An unstable hip can cause serial distortion patterns, which are predictable patterns of dysfunction throughout the kinetic chain that lead to inevitable injuries. That report went on to say that many of the most common strength training programs can actually cause imbalances, like the hip extensors becoming much stronger than the hip flexors, or that weak gluteus medius can lead to an increase in the line of pull on the quadricep muscle group. So, that means that even if you're engaging in some sort of strength training program, it is still worth taking a look at how that program may be affecting your hips. And that even goes for runners, because hip strength and mobility are important for runners too. Many runners blame their feet or their footwear for some of the most common injuries, but these problems more often are caused by something further up that kinetic chain. And yes, I do mean the hips. Frequently, the physiotherapists that I know tell me that they usually look first at the hips and pelvis for biomechanical causes of the loads of running injuries. Sure, sometimes there is a problem with a runner's feet, but by promoting good hip function, using a focus on strength, mobility, and most importantly, stability, well, that can be extremely effective for good running form. And you know what? Sitting actually makes it worse. Sitting in a conventional chair or on a couch causes your hip flexors to shorten. When we sit for more of the day than we stand, this shortening really becomes an issue. And no, that 45-minute yoga class a few times per week is not enough to undo this damage. Sitting also weakens our glutes, and both our glutes and our hip flexors are an important part of activating our hips. When our flexors are tight and our glutes are weak, the lower back is actually forced to take over for them, and that can be bad news because the lower back and the lumbar spine is built for support and stability, not a ton of activity. On the other hand, our hips are built to generate a lot of strength and power. They're made for activity and mobility. But when we sit too much and we let them get weak, the other joints and muscles have to pick up the slack. Now, this type of load balancing that the body does is certainly cool and important, but it's not a long-term solution. We do not want to go through our life letting one part of the body go on vacation while the other parts get overused and worn out. I mean, that's just not good body economics. Okay, how are we going to keep those hips moving? Well, the hip region includes several large, overlapping muscle groups. And if any of them are allowed to get too tight, it can cause problems. And there are a ton of stretches and some complicated yoga poses that you could do. Or, you know what? You could just remember to get up at least on an hourly basis and unfurl those poor contracted hip flexors. Now, aside from that very easy and basic maneuver, 3 of my favorite hip exercises that you can do pretty much anywhere and anytime are hip hikes, fire hydrants, and hip bridges. So let's start with hip hikes, or what can also be called a hip hitch or a pelvic list. Now, hip hitching requires 2 joints of action. One hip is lifting because of spinal lateral flexion, or the lateral flexors lifting what is called the ilium. The other hip performs an abduction movement to assist through the frontal plane by moving the pelvis from the femur. And okay, I know that sounds really complicated, but all you need to know is this. First, stand with one foot on a stair or a block, with the other foot hanging over the edge and dangling free. Then, lift that lower free leg and hip through a full range of motion in an up and down type of movement. You make sure to keep the rest of your body as still as possible. And you can repeat this for 10 or 15 times per side and do 3 sets of that. Now, if that still doesn't really make sense to you, you can go to quickanddirtytips.com/getfitguy and find the show notes for this episode, and I'm going to link to a video from Nutritious Movement that has a great demonstration of how to do the hip hitch, or as Katie Bowman in the video calls it, a pelvic list. Doesn't matter what you call it, it's a great exercise. Now, the next exercise is fire hydrants. Now, the fire hydrant is an excellent exercise for strengthening your gluteus maximus. Because your glutes are the biggest muscle in your pelvis and hip region, it is responsible for the 3 major hip movements: hip extension, hip external rotation, and hip abduction. Now, the fire hydrant involves all 3 of those movements, which is why it is such a great movement. And to do the fire hydrant, you basically get down on your hands and knees, align your shoulders with your hands and your hips with your knees. Then keep your neck neutral and look straight down at the floor. You don't want to crane your neck. Then you lift one leg up and away from your body at a 45-degree angle while keeping your knee at a 90-degree angle. Yes, just like a dog who happened to walk past a fire hydrant. You got it. Then lower your leg back down to the starting position and do it again. And you can do 10 or 15 of these on each leg. Now, pro tip, make sure you keep your hips flat and parallel to the floor. Don't cheat by rotating from the waist. The movement should all be in the hip. Now, the next exercise is called hip bridges. The main target muscle of the hip bridge is the erector spinae, which runs from your neck all the way down to your tailbone. Now, doing this exercise stretches and engages your hip abductors, your gluteus maximus, and your hamstrings. On the other end of the movement, on the way down, the rectus abdominis, the obliques, and the quadricep get a workout due to the need to stay stable. Now, to do this one, you start laying on your back with your knees bent and your arms down by your hips. Your feet should be about hip width apart with your heels as close to your buttocks as you're comfortable with. Then push up through your heels and lift your hips off the ground while contracting your glutes. Then, at the top of the movement, you want to create one straight diagonal line from your shoulders all the way to your knees. Then you pause there in that diagonal position and then start to lower back down slowly. Don't rush this one. And once again, you can do 10 or 15 reps of this movement for a total of 3 sets. Now, once again, if you go to quickanddirtytips.com/getfitguy and look for the show notes for this episode, I will link to a video by a guy named James Dunn if you need a little bit of extra help figuring out how to do this one properly. A healthy balance of hip strength and mobility is very important to ensure everyday stability and also to prevent overuse and other athletic injuries. Achieving this balance isn't a problem if you keep it in mind. Don't sit too much for too long and occasionally weird out your coworkers by laying down in the conference room and doing some hip bridges. Now, make sure to tune in next week because I have a special guest. Yep, it is the fittest woman in the world. I'm going to save everything else for next week so you can get some surprises, but you're not going to want to miss this one. It's a really good interview with some great nuggets of information about how to get super duper fit. Get Fit Guy was written, narrated, and produced by me, Brock Armstrong, with editorial support from Karen Hertzberg. Our audience development and marketing coordinator here at Quick and Dirty Tips is Morgan Ratner. Our digital ad operations coordinator is Michelle Margulis, and our digital assistant is Emily Miller. And of course, our vice president and fearless leader is Kathy Doyle. If you enjoy this podcast, remember you can find me on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Get Fit Guy, and you can send me a message there. Happy to respond. And you can also find me at brockarmstrong.com. Now, I have free newsletters. I'm posting stuff all the time, all over the place, so make sure to find me, and I hope you enjoy all the information that I put out there. Now, what are you waiting for? Get out there and strengthen those hips.